as we fix technical issues, because of course we only tested this in very passing before it actually happened.
Yeah.
Actually, we're gonna basically talk about three things today. We're gonna talk about the Mercer Street attack. We're gonna talk about Asphalt Princess, and we're also gonna sort of kick on Afghanistan, the Taliban, China, the various stuff that's happened over the past week. That sort of got thrown into the back of everything, just due to the nature of Afghanistan's precocious neighbor to the west. So I think let's just start on Mercer Street. Thanks everyone for joining. In the bunker. So from what we know, just starting off, the attack was perpetrated by Iran. That's what most of the evidence shows at this point. We have a good idea of the drone that was used, of, how it was used most likely. I'm gonna just start off by saying we know that one British sailor was killed, a security guard, and also a Romanian national as well.
Mm.
Um, so that's definitely something that was incredibly sad to see. The Israel says that the attack was carried out by Iran. Um, we also have evidence that the drone was, and I'm gonna post a good thread in chat from Elint News um, about the drone that was used. It looks like it was Shahed 136. It's this delta wing drone that Iran has definitely demonstrated in the past against a number of different targets. It has a really good range, um, which the Houthis have used numerous times to attack targets all over Saudi Arabia. Um, Including sites around southern Saudi Arabia, and actually going as far north as Riyadh. And of course, these are fairly small drones. They're relatively hard to actually shoot down. Not so much because they have stealthy characteristics per se, more just because they're so small that it's sort of hard for conventional systems to detect and shoot them down. So that's something that the U.S. has actually been working on figuring out how to counter. Um, and then I'm also gonna post a great thread from Putin is Virus, who also runs the Osint editor channel, which I do work with frequently. Um, Going over the logistics of how an attack like that would work. Basically, there's only a set amount of range that we could actually see coming from Iran, and the ship was further away than that. So they most likely actually used another drone as a repeater station, or they were using a small ship as a repeater station as well. This sort of just demonstrates that this is a fairly advanced attack, and it's definitely, I guess, an example of how smaller nations have gained the ability to strike targets very, very far away with relatively amazing precision. So I'll just kick it down to you guys to sort of discuss the ramifications of this attack as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that we knew this kind of an attack was going to come at some point. I think we all agreed in a previous episode of the podcast that the US reaction to Iran's behaviour in the past has been somewhat subdued, laid back, and that it's really been Israel that's been pushing for Iran to be dealt with appropriately for their behaviour. Um, and I think now we're seeing that Iran is feeling a little bit bolder. When the initial reports came in about, obviously, the incident yesterday as well, there were reports of as many as 4 ships potentially targeted. And that's
Yeah,
obviously
I
of
mean,
much concern for, you know, the US, the UK, pretty much every nation that uses those shipping lanes or that has an issue with Iran.
Absolutely. And at the same time, a lot of the response that we've seen, at least coming from the US right now, seems to be putting the onus for response on the UK and Israel. Um, I spent a bit too long yesterday watching some press conferences at both State Department and the Pentagon. The Pentagon was mainly focused on the shooting yesterday, which doesn't seem like it was a terror attack at all. So just to clarify that for anyone who is wondering. But the State Department and the State Department spokesman seem to really be harping on the fact that basically there's nothing that Iran can really do to poke any nations, or at least the US, into directly responding right now. Um, the US seems to be mostly focused on getting some sort of nuclear deal signed. Um, so that's definitely something that the US is trying to move forward with. Um, the statements that we also saw specifically about uh, how do I put this? Letting the UK take the lead, at least from what I saw. UK action would have to be assisted by the US, mainly just because of the nature of how any response would happen, and putting the onus almost entirely on the UK to develop and then lead a response to any sort of attack like this. It sort of is also trying to make it so that any response will be as small as possible. Um, so that's definitely something that we're faced with going into the future. Um, and then on top of that, of course, the insistence by the U.S. right now, or the current administration, that a nuclear deal is the best way to progress. Um, Even though the Iranians have made it fairly clear at this point that they want to develop a nuclear weapon and that they will. Um, but I it's a very, very difficult situation to watch and to see happen. From what it looks like externally, um, the US really doesn't want things to escalate. Israel cannot let Iran acquire nuclear weapons, and Britain is sort of stuck in the middle of gauging what type of response they're sort of going to put together. And I think at this point the UK will color any future response, and there's a lot of questions about whether or not they can give credence to any sort of Israeli response, because we know the Israelis are gunning for some sort of serious response, as seen by Foreign Minister Gantz, who is literally speaking at the UN right now. And he just said Iran is about 10 weeks away from acquiring enough highly enriched nuclear material to acquire a nuclear weapon, or to build a nuclear device. Um, and the Israeli position is, of course, the Iranians are never going to be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. Um, so that's a big thing that will color their potential response as well. And it looks like they're trying to set up some sort of, I don't know, casus belli for um a response. They're trying to sort of justify any potential action they'll take against Iran. Granted, at the same time, I've talked with Israelis, and basically the first priority is not letting Iran get a nuclear weapon.
Mm.
Sort of any PR and any sort of international relation issues come after that. Um, so you have to sort of remember that's where their established base is.
Yeah, and obviously we've had the announcement today, haven't we, that Iran is as little as 10 weeks away from a nuclear weapon, um, which is obviously a huge concern and no doubt something the Israelis intend to raise at the UN today, along with raising everything else that has gone on. Um,
Yeah, and we also did see Iran, sort of after the threats came out from Israel and the UK about properly responding to the Mercer Street attack, especially the head of the British Army, Sir Nick Carter, saying that the UK must retaliate against Iran. We did see this that this not threats per se, but more reiterating of established understanding that Iran has the ability to um how do I put this not shut down trade in the region, but make it financially impossible. All they would have to do is attack a few ships, and insurance rates would become practically impossible to pay for most of these shipping companies. We've also seen, of course, container units have gone up insanely in prices. Basically, to put it all together, this is not a time where you want extra stress on the global trade system, the global trade network. Um, and I think Iran knows this, and I think the US and the UK understands this as well. Um, so this is definitely something that everyone has an understanding of, and no one really wants to make the first move. Iran will continue to, of course, do their standard terror actions in the region, as we saw, especially with the Asphalt Princess attack. Um, but it's sort of this this status quo, and everyone is waiting for another person to sort of take the first step and uh, do the first aggressive action. And Iran, of course, wants it to be someone else, so they will continue with small probing attacks and basically attempting to get other countries to finally, make a major first strike. Um, so with the Asphalt Princess, uh, after they couldn't take the ship to Iran because the crew sabotaged the engines, um, they abandoned the ship so they wouldn't be caught in the act, which is definitely goes back to that establishment of Iran basically wants to have this a slight level of plausible deniability where they can say, we weren't directly responsible for this, or oh, this must have been another actor in the region. Um, and so it's everyone's sort of playing this game of chicken, except one person is kicking rocks at everyone else in the room. So I think at this point, looking at the whole Golden Brilliant situation, um, as well with there was a duty officer who saw a low flying drone in the area, which actually may end up being one of the signs of a direct Iranian involvement. Initially, a lot of us, and I think John, you had mentioned this. Um, that this might have been an attack committed by sort of a faction within the IRGC that wasn't actually under direct control from the Iranian government. Um, did you want to talk about that a tiny bit more?
Yeah, I mean, the timing of the attack yesterday was interesting because obviously Iran has just gotten a new president. Um, and I think, generally speaking, the impression was that it was possibly a case of the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps were either acting of their own volition or the new president had pretty much straight away decided he wanted to test the waters and see, what he could get away with. As you say, there was an officer on board. What was the ship called?
It was the Golden Brilliant.
The Golden Brilliant, who saw the Iranian drone, or at least one Iranian drone, fly past, seemingly scouting the ship out, um, and obviously proceeding south towards um, the ship that was then attacked. And they notified the UK MTO, and obviously things developed from there. But Iran has been very, very, very clear that it is denying all involvement in these attacks. They are trying very, very desperately in some cases to distance themselves and not making themselves look too great in the process. One of their spokespersons, for example, pretty much said, yeah, no, we didn't do it, but if we had done it, this is the sort of thing we would have done, which is not a good look for Iran. He then went on to say, "Oh, we've got all these ships on standby to rescue sailors if needs be, and so on." I think it will be interesting to see what evidence the Israelis bring before the UN for obviously the attack on the Mercer Street last week, and then this second attack yesterday. But I think at the moment it's fair to say that the UK Maritime Trade Organisation is pretty much controlling the story and all the details surrounding it in the media, particularly for yesterday's attack, because although they've not said an awful lot, and we woke up this morning to the news that the incident was declared over and that the Iranians had supposedly abandoned the ship, details as to exactly how, why, what have been very, very hard to come by.
Yeah, the W's of the situation, who, what, when, where, why, and we know the how, at least at this point. We know that there was at least one small boat involved, from what the reports were, that were heard over the radio to the UAE Coast Guard. It was 5 to 6 Iranians armed who boarded the ship. The crew did a fairly, heroic thing and actually sabotaged their own engines so that the Iranians couldn't sail back into Iranian territorial waters, which that explains why the ship was only moving at about 1 knot, almost drifting to the north. But going back to the whole levels of involvement, when it comes to maritime stuff, in Iran, there are two organizations. There's the IRGC, and then there's the Iranian Navy. The IRGCN, which is the Iranian Guard Corps Navy, is primarily small boats, almost paramilitary. Um, with sort of the IRGC has a certain level of autonomy inside the Iranian government, which gives them a lot of ability to act uh, without sanction or without permission from higher ups in the government. So the president it doesn't always have the highest level of control. We saw that with Rouhani, um, and we saw that with other Iranian leaders. Was that the IRGC, especially when Soleimani was in charge, had a lot of room to play and to order their own operations, which again is why the leadership of the IRGC has been so important for the Ayatollah to control and to appoint. So usually the leader of the IRGC sort of serves as a direct representative of the Ayatollah in that role. And then, but at the lower levels, because of this sort of near paramilitary makeup, the IRGC has this ability, and it has the ability to act when senior leadership is decapitated, but at the same time, that ability to act independently can also lead to actors individually taking action if they want something to happen. So if there was a regional commander who, say, wanted something to kick off, um, he might have, sent out a few guys in a boat and, a drone to go find a ship to take back. Um, and we've seen this before. In general, it was thought that the Global Hawk shoot down over the Strait of Hormuz may have not been officially sanctioned by the Iranian government. Um, and that was a big one where the U.S. I know Trump said he didn't want to respond because all the potential deaths it might cause. It was most likely because the attack itself wasn't directly sanctioned.
Hmm.
Um, and so when seeing Iranian actions, and again, this is probably why the U.S. is partially taking the cautious tone right now, um, is because we aren't sure yet how high up the order went. If it came from the top, if someone, in the top of the IRGC sanctioned this attack, this definitely gives a lot more credence to the Israeli plan of, a harsher response versus the US plan of a lighter response, because again, you don't want to bow to what, some local commander wanted the US to do, let's
Yeah.
cause an issue and let's make something bad happen. Um and so we sort of saw or we don't know yet. The drone lends some credence that this potentially involved multiple groups of IRGC soldiers, so it, indicates some higher level of commanding involvement. But apart from that, again, that's probably what the intelligence community in the U.S. and the UK and most likely in Israel as well is trying to figure out.
Yeah, and as you say,
And
if it is an order that has come from the very top of the IRGC, or even from the political overlords in Iran, maybe even directly from the new president, Mr. Raisi himself, um, it's a huge difference to whether it's just a low-level attack by a rogue commander, so to speak, um, and to a certain extent, the US and Israel and the UK will have to be able to prove where the orders come from at the UN in order to justify whatever retaliation they decide to carry out.
yeah, that's definitely an element. And it does seem like Gantz is at the UN right now, sort of trying to give a justification. Um, it is also good to remember that Raisi has not formed a government yet.
Mm.
So he doesn't exactly have as much domestic control over the country right now as he normally would. So this may be the IRGC sort of demonstrating to him that they have, a certain level of control over the country. Um, or it may be, again, he is a hardliner. There isn't much known about him apart from the fact that he is very loyal to the Ayatollah. He was from the Soleimani camp. He definitely was prepared to institute his own level of, of control that was more similar to what the Ayatollah and to what formerly alive Soleimani would have wanted. But it, again, we of course do not know what politically is happening inside the higher echelons of Iranian politics.
Mm.
We have no idea. At this point, I probably don't think the US or the UK has a good idea yet, because we would see either stronger statements of, we're going to move forward with a peaceful revolution, or you would have seen some sort of harder response. So at this point, I think a lot of countries in the region are sort of trying to figure out what's happening. Um, and of course, the Saudis have made themselves clear, but they don't exactly have the not the ability per se, but the political will right now to directly form some sort of response against Iran.
Yeah, and in the Saudis' case, that's obviously partly because they are so heavily involved in fighting in Yemen still, and also because in the wider Middle East, as much as tensions between Israel and the Arab countries have softened in recent months, um, it's fair to say that there are still a number of Arab countries who are still very, very close to Iran, or at the very least are diplomatically on good terms with them. And so, if the US and Israel want to try and get those countries on side, they are going to have a bit of a fight with it. And they are likely to have to try and negotiate with those countries as to what kind of response will be acceptable. Because ultimately, if the response is viewed in Iran as being over the top and things continue to escalate, those other countries are going to want to have a say in whatever action takes place, and obviously they'll want to be prepared for any fallout should that occur.
Yeah, and of course, when it comes to politics and any sort of response, you know, stuff isn't black and white. Big shocker, I know. But it's something that a lot of countries have to balance with any potential response, and it's why things, take time. A lot of people, want to see some sort of immediate response, but the immediate response in this situation was sailing, the Iwo Jima amphibious response group down to where the incident took place and, basically parking it there, which is what it seems like they did. Um, so that was the immediate response. And now multiple countries are trying to formulate a response. More in the long term, of course, I think Israel's sort of given out, sort of this with their speech at the UN, saying that Iran's about 10 weeks away from having enough fissile material to construct a nuclear device.
Mm.
Um, I think they've sort of set the longer term deadline for the other Western countries to sort of get together and do something. Um, so that's sort of that's sort of our end deadline for something to happen. Um, but at this point, um, there's a lot we can potentially see until then, and I think the current U.S. administration definitely wants to exhaust every single diplomatic option before they actually move forward with any sort of other options. Um, and whether or not that is the best move, that's what they're going to be doing. Um, and I think definitely the Israelis are not as happy with that. Um, and that's why they've set this sort of this 10-week deadline at the UN, which is what this seems to be sort of forming together as, um, and I think, of course, I can't speak as well to sort of the internal British sort of political ideas over this. I think John, you would be a bit better at speaking to that, but just sort of, I guess internal feelings also definitely color the way any potential response would be. I don't know if you can talk to that better than I can.
I think it's fair to say that the news, obviously, of the British death has not um, played as majorly in UK media as I would have imagined.
It
Um,
featured very lightly at the start of basically informing you such and such this is what happened, and then when they bring it up, it's brought up as basically a fleeting mention, just as an by the way, it killed a British person kind of attitude.
mm, yeah, it's there's been very little said other than perhaps by the Foreign Secretary, obviously Dominic Raab, who has made repeated statements, um, all of which have been somewhat subdued in nature and you know. Um, Unfortunately, that's not a surprise. I'm just looking at Twitter now, and the US Secretary of State has tweeted again to say that he's reiterated his condolences to Dominic Raab for the loss of the UK citizen. Worth saying that we do now know the identity of the UK citizen. He is ex-British Army, worked for the security firm in question. I did have his name written down somewhere. Let me see if I can find that.
It is Adrian Underwood.
Yeah, Adrian Underwood. I haven't been able to find much about his military service, but obviously, like I say, ex-British Army, and the UK Chief of the Defence Staff, General Nick Carter, has obviously issued a statement in relation to that and expressed his condolences, obviously, to the family. Adrian was a married father of one, so no doubt his family are feeling that loss quite keenly right now.
Yeah, and there is a fundraiser which I'm working to authenticate, and I will post once I'm able to. Just haven't entirely been able to do that yet. But on top of that, I think this is definitely something that moved the British public less than I thought it would. At least, as an external observer, at least the American sort of red line, at least set out by the Trump administration, was no American deaths. I'm not sure how that continued over into the Biden administration. Nothing really was established on that clearly, but it's definitely something that maybe because he was a maritime security officer, and that sort of comes with the trade, I guess. But it's just the public reaction to this was not one that I expected coming into this, and maybe I sort of need to reframe my view on sort of how I guess the media wanted to portray this, or it's not even how the media wanted to portray this at this point, but more so even the British public at large, watching social media and watching at least the social channels I'm familiar with in England, it really didn't seem like there was too much of an outcry or response. Um, but on top of that, the British government has made definite statements about some sort of response, as much as I've seen so far on any individual events. Obviously, the head of the British Army said that a response is coming.
Mm.
What that may be, I'm not sure. Again, the U.S. has, quote, put the U.K. in charge of any response, or let the U.K. take the lead on it. Um, I'm not entirely sure whether or not they've also said the UK is taking the lead on militarily, responding. So, any sort of potential strike or whatever. Um, but at this point, a lot of countries are afraid to take action against Iran, just due to the nature of, the ability of Iran to control the Strait of Hormuz. And at this point, with their ability to project drone attacks out hundreds of miles away from Iranian borders. Um, so we've seen this sort of this level of response, and at this point, again, you know, trying to seize an asphalt tanker and failing, most likely, at least on the U.S. end of things, isn't going to provoke a full response yet. Um, I think the Israelis have sort of outlined what they believe is a necessary response, but at this point, I'm not sure any country really has the political motivation per se to actually respond.
Yeah.
Um, and of course, Iran, with their provocative actions, is trying to bait some sort of conflict, whether that be, to establish the new president or to avoid internal issues. So it all depends on what steps Iran is going to take. I think Iran definitely has control right now of what sort of escalation we see, and I don't know whether or
Iran,
not you.
I was going to say sort of agree because Iran at the moment could continue. At the moment, it's got nothing to say that why they wouldn't continue to push and prod and see how far they can truly go. So they could escalate it a step further anytime they want. Right now,
Yeah, and I think it's this sort of established idea that as long as Iran isn't causing massive issues, actually affecting, tanker traffic. And I took a look at both how insurance rates are doing on tankers and general shipping in the area, and it hasn't really skyrocketed yet. So I mean, I don't usually like saying this, but there is no economic incentive. I know, we all try to, say sanctity of life and, revenge for, acting against a country's citizens, but at some point there's got to be the money there. There's got to be, some level of economic incentive to do that, and there's a lot of negatives for fighting against Iran, and there really aren't that many positives at the moment. If Iran changes and starts taking this more aggressive approach
Mm.
than they have so far, then yes, I absolutely believe we'll see a larger scale response. But until then, the economic ramifications of a large scale response, the cost benefit just isn't there yet. I mean, again, I'll separate my own personal views about what should happen, preemptively against Iran versus, what I believe the general assessment in the West is. But from what we've seen, again, the Israeli opinion is definitely different. They, have this hard line: Iran cannot acquire nuclear weapons. But in the West, it's definitely not the same
Yeah.
assessment. It's if Iran starts practically threatening, that property and that potential trade in the region.
Yeah, and obviously for Israel, it's a case of they know that if Iran obtains nuclear weapons, that immediately becomes more of a threat to them. Whereas I feel like, particularly the UK and the US, are not that they don't have that level of concern because they're not geographically that close, and they're obviously not, you know, that much of a sworn enemy. As much as the US has caused Iran a great deal of anger, and or at least the Iranian government a great deal of anger in the last few years, particularly during the Trump administration. Um, I think realistically, if Iran does obtain a nuclear weapon and does decide to use nuclear weapons, Israel is going to be the target, you know, every single time. And obviously, Israel is entirely correct to be concerned about that and to be fighting to try and ensure that Iran does not get nuclear weapons. And we've spoken about the fact that at the minute the US is very focused, almost too focused, on trying to return to this JCPOA uh, agreement, this the nuclear deal that they are so desperate to keep active and to bring back from the days of Obama. Um, and you kind of have to wonder at this point, if Iran is so close to nuclear weapons, what is the point in having a nuclear deal? Because the whole point of the nuclear deal was to prevent Iran getting nuclear weapons, and yet they're going to get them anyway.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm going back to the whole idea that the you sort of have to start with the idea that the U.S. does not want to go to war with Iran. Like that would be the absolute last case scenario. Um, and so sort of at least the idea, at least among the sort of the Obama Biden group of people, that sort of foreign policy think tank group of people, is that you will take all the necessary actions you need in order to delay a potential war or conflict, or even prevent it, and to only use war in the as the last possible option. Um, and so they will continue to try taking diplomatic steps until war becomes basically inevitable, and there will be no, or they will try to avoid as much as possible any sort of preemptive strike or escalation per se. It's this idea that only responses really in this case are warranted. Um, and so you have this general idea, at least in the U.S. foreign policy sort of machine, which is sort of why the U.S. again is letting the U.K. take the lead on this,
Mm.
because they want this more measured response, and they want this more minor response. Because when we think about it, I mean, I know you guys probably have a better idea of this than me, but what practical, if the UK had to formulate a response on its own, what practical response could we even see?
To be
From
honest,
a UK perspective, practical response, nothing kinetic. I just there just isn't the appetite.
yeah,
You're
Yeah.
probably gonna look at more just like they discussed cyber attacks, but they said, "Oh, cyber attacks are on the table." But then again, if you're gonna launch a cyber attack, you ain't gonna say you're gonna do one, are you?
Well, it's not even that. I mean, what practical ramifications of a cyber attack could there be? I'm trying to think. It, it's not like Iran is a third world backwards country, but what what damage could you do to the Iranian military or the Iranian sort of security and terror apparatus through some sort of cyber attack?
I think it's hard to say because obviously we don't know specifically what would be considered as a target for a cyber attack. Obviously, the UK has only recently
Fi-
stood up this national cyber force, which is intended to sort of carry out the offensive side of cyber activities.
Probably going to look at more. I was going to say you'd probably be looking at more sort of like infrastructure-based stuff, power plants,
Mm.
IT networks, cell phone communications.
And I think
Yeah.
it's
I
worth
mean,
saying as well that the fact that the statements from the UK have been limited to the Foreign Secretary, so we haven't, as far as I'm aware, we haven't had any statement from the Prime Minister. We've not had any statement from Defence Secretary or pretty much anyone else in sort of the heads of government. It has literally been Foreign Secretary and the Chief of the General Staff making brief statements. I don't think we will see a response from the UK, whether it be kinetic or cyber. I just don't see the political will being there. Obviously, the UK carrier strike group is now well away from the region, and won't be returning until they start the return journey later this year. So that's not even a show of force option there.
Yeah, and I will comment on the ongoing debate in the chat right now, but Iran sort of has this two-tiered strategy of their first bottom tier is relying on terror actions and this sort of low speed, very very light kinetic series of actions against regional actors, like utilizing Hezbollah and utilizing the Houthis to both harass Israel and Saudi Arabia. But their actual war strategy is, if I were to compare it more to another actual example, would be the Japanese decisive battle doctrine, the Kantai Kessen. Of they basically, Iran would have to win the first battle of any war in order to actually make that war work. And I think that's the current thinking inside the Iranian military apparatus, and sort of the Iranian foreign apparatus would be sort of basically coming up with initial victory that is so strong that Western countries and Israel's allies, especially, would consider a war unfeasible, making a long term war impossible, because Iran cannot win this long term conflict. They sort of have to win this first decisive battle. I.e., something like knocking out an American carrier strike group in the area and mining the Straits of Hormuz. They sort of, without decisive action like that, they really cannot win a longer term conflict at all.
Mm.
And so I think, and that is from what I've understood, that is what the sort of current Iranian thinking is, versus what it was back in the 80s fighting Iraq, where it was more this long term, slow, almost World War One style meat grinder. Um, and that definitely did damage a lot of the people who are in charge now, into almost not accepting something like that as a possible option. And then I guess I just I feel like the current sort of status quo at this point is this established is this established positioning, and I don't think any country really wants to be the first one to change it.
Mm.
Um, which is why Iran is going to continue what they've been doing for the past 20 years. Israel is going to continue to I guess, prepare for this action against Iran that they probably have been preparing for 20 years, to eventually counter this potential Iranian, nuclear expansion, and this acquisition of a nuclear weapon. Because that sort of nuclear weapon and the acquisition of nuclear weapons sort of does fit in fairly well to that Iranian idea of having this one decisive action that wins them any long term conflict before it even really starts. Um, so that idea of starting and ending the war really really in one day, or 1 week, gives them this sort of this established, or this, not established per se, but this pervasive idea, that they have, that if they are able to win that entire war in 1 day or 1 week, they will sort of be able to control the situation. Um, and I don't know if you guys sort of disagree or agree with me on that one, but that's sort of the outside observer view I have of this situation, at least right now.
Hmm.
And I think this is what the Israelis also work on the assumption of they have this sort of they sort of have this idea that if they're able to or if they're able to stop any potential Iranian decisive action before it happens, they'll win it, because they can fight this sort of this low grade Iranian action, with the deployment of the Iron Dome, and with sort of intense IDF action. They're able to counter the low grade sort of kinetic stuff that Iran is doing. But it's all about preventing the sort of the 0 day event of whatever Iran is planning, whether that be striking Iranian nuclear facilities, or countering the ability of Iran to build nuclear weapons, or sort of assassinating Iranian leadership, and working with the U.S. to sort of counter the best of what Iran is able to put together, which is what we saw with the Soleimani strike. Though granted, the Soleimani strike is a whole nother can of worms that would require an entire podcast probably to talk about.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, as long as both sides, and I think the current US view is, as long as they can keep the Middle East sort of this low speed, tit for tat conflict, it's fine, as long as everything doesn't blow up, which means, when eventually the Israelis have to, finish the job of preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, it's sort of these two sides of the coin right now. Is the U.S. is going for the diplomatic option, and the Israelis are planning for whatever kinetic option has to happen. And that sort of has changed based on whatever administration is in power. But at this point, I sort of have this belief that the U.S. is sort of going on the assumption that if the nuclear deal fails, or if any potential deal doesn't come together, the Israelis will sort of be there to counter any Iranian action with sort of a kinetic response. So basically, the U.S. gets the benefit of both sides, of both being able to be the peacemaker in the region, and they also would, if things fall apart, they don't necessarily have to be the ones attacking Iran in the first place.
Yeah.
Which is sort of why I believe that the attack against the the hijacking of the Asphalt Princess, and the attack against the Mercer Street won't necessarily end in a kinetic response, unless it is some form of, continuing that status quo tit for tat. So the possibly the worst, or sorry, the biggest escalation I could see would be, I don't know, maybe a strike on whatever drone team was responsible, or whatever launch vehicles were responsible for the Mercer Street attack. I don't know if you guys think there's another possible option, but that's what I think is the most possible kinetic response.
Yeah, I'm inclined to
And
agree. Go on.
yeah, to answer the chat question, it, the kinetic response would be small. It would definitely be small in scale, just because, keeping to that sort of tit for tat motion. The Israelis did establish who was responsible, most likely, for the drone attack. So potentially attacking, a UAV development site, or a UAV launch site might be in order. I would have to go back. I haven't been keeping up my map of Iranian facilities as well as I should have. But there are definitely sites in, southern Iran, that if you wanted to actually hit them, you could to make a statement. But the US really doesn't want to risk the conflict, spiraling out of control. So you might see a kinetic action that's actually more reserved and less violent per se.
Yeah. And it's worth remembering, obviously, that in the last few instances where the Israelis have wanted to target Iran, the US has very much been a force for sort of restricting how significant a response the Israelis give. Chances are we're going to see that again. Like you say, I can't imagine this response is going to be huge. I very much doubt that, as I said, the UK will be any sort of kinetic response. It will very much be leading, I would imagine, the diplomatic offensive at the UN and elsewhere. The US is obviously kind of withdrawing from the Middle East as much as it can. We've obviously spoken before about Afghanistan, and we'll come a little bit more to that again later. But yeah, I think the Israelis are very keen to respond, but I think particularly with the situation with the Mercer Street, the very fact that the dead are British and Romanian and not Israeli has kind of perhaps cooled things down a little bit, and has meant that the Israeli response hasn't been as immediate as perhaps it might have been.
Yeah, and the Israelis are also okay with continuing their ongoing tanker war. Um, of this, Israel is also prepared to play the asymmetric game of fighting Iran on their own turf. If Iran does a veiled attack on a ship, then Israel is going to do a veiled attack on a ship. So I believe if we don't see some sort of solid kinetic response, I do think the Israelis will continue their asymmetric tanker war going on right now. So they will continue, striking Iranian tankers in the region. And that's definitely something I believe will continue to happen. Whereas sort of the UK doesn't have that ace. I guess it's not that they don't have the ability to conduct an asymmetric strike, but that's sort of not in their toolbox of foreign policy ideas.
Yeah, it's not
Um,
standard operating procedure, really, is it, for the UK? Whereas for Israel,
yeah,
it is very much something they do regularly and to great
yeah,
effect.
and that's why I think Israel is, the best equipped to deal with situations like this, is because they've basically built their entire, foreign response modus operandi on countering actions like that. So they sort of have the ability to counter those actions. Um, and again, that sort of pisses Iran off a lot, because Iran sort of wants this, decisive event to happen, and Israel isn't really giving them that opportunity. Because if Iran were to do something like unprovoked mine the Strait of Hormuz, they would have every country in the world come down on them. Even countries like Russia and probably China as well would counter them in that in a circumstance like that, because it's unacceptable. It's this their number one major response plan is unacceptable to a lot of other countries. On the other hand, if the US or the UK or Israel was to directly strike them, then their response would be not justified per se, but they would be able to continue receiving the backing from some countries,
Mm.
um, which is just something I see definitely. It's just that makes it such an untenable option for other countries to sort of do this kinetic response. Because the potential downsides are very, very large, and the potential upsides, I mean, they really aren't there. You aren't going to dislodge the Iranian regime with a single airstrike,
No.
or a single set of strikes, and you aren't going to make major regime changes with any sort of solid kinetic action. So it's this terrible option to have, and it's something that no country really wants to do, apart from Israel, who will only take said kinetic action when it becomes the last choice, which they're saying is about, say, 10 weeks away. yeah, that's the base of basically the entire situation right now. I think we'll probably just move on to Afghanistan real quick before we wrap everything up for today.
Hmm.
Um, so from what it looks like, the Taliban are taking this very, very intensive set of offensives over the past week. Um, they ran out of some steam over the past month. They stopped making huge gains, but recently they've launched a very major offensive in a number of different districts. I know in the north of the country they've made a lot of progress. In the south of the country, they've also made some progress in Kandahar. We actually saw news today that Marshal Dostum actually has returned to the north of the country. Um, so there are some rumors that he intends to start to put together some militias again to counter sort of the massive Taliban offensive in the north that has effectively sort of captured that former Northern Alliance territory that we saw was integral to the U.S. offensive in 2001. So he's probably trying to get a jump on that situation as a whole. Um, and then we also saw the Taliban make major offensive gains in Takhar as well. They're in Takhar City. It looks like they're getting very close to a prison that is holding Taliban prisoners from the uh, uh, through the Afghan security forces. So if they do that, that's going to be somewhat of a loss. I think there was a reporter, an Afghan reporter, that basically said the Taliban hit the panic button this week, and they're trying to put sort of this maximum pressure on the regime, or not the regime. Calling it the regime is probably not the greatest thing to call the current Afghan government, but we also, I again watching the State Department press conference. It was very interesting. The current answer to, why is the U.S. still in Doha when they believe that, the Taliban is going to take Afghanistan anyway. There's no real point to be doing this negotiation, between the Afghan government, the U.S., and the Taliban if the Taliban are making these massive gains and intend to take Afghan militarily. And the answer was basically no country that has been founded on, or no government that was founded on a violent takeover has ever had legitimacy. And I found that answer very interesting, because I can think of probably 20 or 30 current governments or
Yeah.
current nations that had a very violent or bloody takeover. I can just think the current Rwandan government is the first and foremost I can think of that had a very violent takeover that's actually ended with the country being successful and recognized internationally, and sort of this reign of peace has broken out per se.
Hmm.
Vietnam, that's another one that was mentioned at the press conference by a reporter. The North Vietnam invaded and took over South Vietnam and fought the U.S. off, and now the U.S. is uh, an I would say an ally at this point. I mean, we just actually didn't sell them. We basically donated them a former Coast Guard cutter to join their Coast Guard. But I think the establishment that no regime built on violence can ever stand is a very bad position to have, because it's not true. Um, but on top of that, it's sort of this establishment that, like, why are we negotiating with the Taliban? Why are we sort of sitting there, in Doha, talking with them as they sort of have this diplomatic front, as while back in Afghanistan they continue to fight the Afghan government and intend to take over militarily. It
Hmm.
just it seems like there's sort of no point at the moment.
Yeah, it's kind of baffling, really, that we've gotten to a point where um, we are so desperate to get troops out of Afghanistan that we are actually negotiating, and it doesn't send a good message either, because at the end of the day, it's fair to say that troops went into Afghanistan to rid Afghanistan of the Taliban. Now, they obviously, whatever your view on it, that has failed because the Taliban are still there, and as you've said, they are growing again. And one has to wonder if, we're going to see a similar situation in Syria and Iraq with Daesh or ISIL in the years to come, because we've been there for 7 years now. And that situation, it's fair to say, as much as they have been flattened and crushed in most of Syria and Iraq, they are not gone. And how long before political appetite for the fighting there expires and we see a similar situation to Afghanistan? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, ISIS is a bit of a different situation in Iraq because a very large portion of the country um, does not or will never allow them to take over, which is sort of different in Afghanistan because a lot of Afghan people, it seems right now that um, they just want the fighting to be over. They it's almost this level of fatigue where they would be okay with the Taliban. And this goes for a lot of the more rural areas and a lot of the areas outside of Kabul that have seen and taken the brunt of this fighting of they're really okay with any government as long as they just stop the fighting.
Hmm.
And they don't care if it's the Taliban because the Taliban to oh look it's Tom
Oh, hello, Tom.
or it's not Tom. Okay. Um but it's how do I put this? They just want the fighting to be over. They really don't care at this point, who it is in charge or what rules they're going to make. They just don't want to be shot at anymore.
Yep.
So that's certainly a big part of the situation and why the Taliban has gotten more support is because once they've kicked the Afghan government forces out, there's no one left to fight, so the fighting inherently stops. Um, and it's this situation that's just it's really sad to see of a lot of these people they just want the fighting to stop and they don't really care who does it. Which is why we haven't seen a lot of resistance, at least in these more rural occupied areas. It's just they don't want to fight anymore.
Mm.
And then going back to the chat question, if you've ever seen Lord of War, Nicolas Cage plays a black market arms dealer, and at the end, not I can't say without spoiling anything, um, but Turkey does our dirty work in the region. It's the same reason why we're friendly with Pakistan is because we need them to be on our side more than we need them to be on the other side. They're much more helpful, even with the shenanigans that they pull, being allied with us than they do being allied with another country. Um, which again, the U.S. and China fighting over Pakistan is definitely an example of that. Um, Pakistan is this key player in the region, and keeping them on our side, at least politically and economically, and especially militarily, is much better than having them on another side. Um, and it's sort of this established status quo of if we lose Turkey to say Russia, that's not something that NATO really wants, even though Turkey is acting against NATO interests in the region. Um, so it's this situation where they're better on our side than being on someone else's side.
Mm.
It sucks to see, but it happens. Um, chat ha- I'll be answering chat questions all day. If chat has any more questions, go ahead, fire them off, and I'll answer them. I don't usually get this opportunity, so feel free to ask us. Tweet at me if you want to. I'll also answer questions that you tweet at me as well.
Yeah.
And I think the same can go for John as well. He'll answer some questions as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Just like technical says, just tweet us, or if you're in chat and you're
Tweet
able
us,
to use it,
chat.
just
There are ways to do this.
ping us in chat as well.
Yeah, because I mean, I think we talked about all the news that already happened this week. Of course, the Pentagon shooting. It doesn't look like it was a terrorist attack.
No, it doesn't appear to be.
To explain this, the Pentagon Transit Center, um, the Pentagon Transit Center is the metro station. It's on Pentagon property, but it's outside the Pentagon security zone. It's sort of under the Pentagon, outside the entrance area. Um, so that's where this shooting occurred, and it's very very sad to see it happen. Obviously, um, it's something that definitely put pressure on the Pentagon, and was not nice to see at all. Questions. Oh, I just got a question. Okay, so talking about what the U.S. is going to be doing politically in Afghanistan. Before the pullout. So the US at this point, I think, has sort of capitulated on the idea that Afghanistan is going to fall politically to another country. I mean, the US does not have the political will or motivation to sort of continue to be involved in Afghanistan at this point. Um, I think worst case scenario politically, Afghanistan sort of or the Taliban are competent enough to put together a country that is internationally recognized. And then we saw the Taliban leadership in Beijing meeting with the Chinese foreign minister. Um, the Taliban falling over to sort of that Chinese side in a diplomatic way, not in a military way, not with a military intervention, not with an invasion, but China winning in Afghanistan diplomatically would not be a great situation. Um, I know some Muslim nations have attacked China over the Uyghurs and the detention and practical genocide against the Uyghur people in Western China, but money speaks. That the Chinese are able to have a lot of control over over this sort of uh, over this area. And next question. Oh, thoughts on the U.S. handing Kabul airport security over to Turkey? Um, Turkey, and I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast. Turkey sort of has this unique diplomatic style that, or not diplomatic, but military intervention style, where I think it's called the Bearcar, or I'm not sure how you pronounce the name of the drone. Diplomacy, where effectively utilizing drone strikes and not that many actual people on the ground has worked really well for them, especially in northern Syria and also in Libya. So if they're able to translate that over into Afghanistan and sort of keep this, I guess, bubble around Kabul in some sort of Western form of control, that will definitely, they'll try to do that. And I think the US is not confident per se that they can do that, but it's Turkey's problem now. Um, the real issue with that is going to be their ability to keep the Afghan government supplied and Kabul supplied basically only through an airport. I don't know how they're going to do that. I don't know how they're going to pull that out. um, or pull that off, but they might be able to. The issue is the Taliban controls practically every international border crossing into Afghanistan, so it's sort of hard to move supplies into there, especially as a lot of Afghanistan's goods come from over the border from Pakistan, and from the north from the former Soviet republics as well. Um, so yeah, I'm not entirely sure. As I said, the main issue right now isn't a military fall in Afghanistan. It's most likely going to be more of an economic collapse than predicated by a collapse of the government. Um, but who knows? The Turks have been able to pull off some interesting achievements um, in the past, and I'm sure they'll also be able to into the future. Maybe, who knows? Um, I don't know, John, if you have any thoughts about that as well. Well, just sort of rely on me there to do that. Yeah, while we're waiting on some more questions. Ooh, yeah. Again, that comes back to the whole principle of it all is that utilizing again the U.S. at the end in Afghanistan. I mean, less people died in 2020 in Afghanistan than U.S. forces than at Fort Hood in Texas. Um, so the U.S. had sort of perfected this utilization of special operations combined with um, drone activity and supporting local Afghan police and sort of putting together this basically this remote warfare. Um, and it was very low cost, especially to human capital and human lives. It was fairly low stress for the troops deployed there, and it was successful. Again, the Taliban basically had this constant fear of if too many of them grouped together, if too many of them met, then you'd have a predator over them in about an hour or two with a few hellfires and this constant pressure on the Taliban sort of made it impossible for them to actually put together an offensive. The second the U.S. stopped that, um, things fell apart. The whole thing holding the Taliban back was the lack of their ability to organize, mostly through the fact that if too many of them got together at any one time, they'd blow up. Um, so I think if the ship might have sailed on that for the Turks, um, because the Taliban have sort of already put together this massive offensive, and the Afghan, military and the Afghan security forces are sort of falling apart. Um, we'll see if they're able to. It's definitely going to be interesting to watch, but yeah, I think that's sort of where the situation is right now. And moving into the future, I mean, interesting to watch. That's a horrifying thing to say. The people of Afghanistan are absolutely suffering horribly,
Hmm.
and I'm you know at some point they're going to want the fighting to stop, and whoever can promise that to them and deliver on it is going to win in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
um
and you've
it's
got to
just a
remember
it's a
that Afghanistan has been facing it's effectively been in a civil war now for well over 40 years, probably closer to 50 years in total. And it's not always been, Taliban and the US. The US has only been involved for 20 years. The US is obviously now leaving, and the situation's not really much better than it was beforehand. Um, in terms of the fact that there is still fighting ongoing, there is still no real political solution. And as you say, the Taliban are now very much a dominant force in the country, and the future doesn't look
yeah,
bright.
it's a genie that's very hard to put back in the bottle. It took the US an actual invasion to turn it around. And we'll see what happens. Obviously, the status quo today is very different than it was 20 years ago. Um, but who knows? And of course, it all depends on what the Taliban are able to do. Um, yeah, that was a question put forward at the press conference at the State Department yesterday. Why are we sitting at, or why are various Western countries sitting at the table in Doha, still negotiating with the Taliban as they openly break the terms of any pre-negotiation, um, actively in Afghanistan at the same time. And the answer to that seems to be, I guess, deny the reality of the situation. I just, I don't really, I don't really know how to sort of balance the reality of the situation with any sort of negotiation happening in Doha. Um, and then yeah, Turkey talking with Taliban, yeah, potentially. That the Taliban sort of have this. need to control the entirety of the country unless they come to an agreement where Turkey can, be some sort of economic sponsor, though that will really piss the US off. Um because I don't think there's an agreement where the Taliban don't have control of the entirety of Afghanistan, and I mean, I don't think the US would be happy if the Turks came to some sort of economic or political agreement with the Taliban in order to, I mean, I don't see any agreement that wouldn't be some sort of sponsorship per se. Um, I see it much more of a situation where China is sort of going to swoop in, um, and become some sort of economic patron to whatever Taliban government springs up in Afghanistan. And that's something that we're going to have to see. Obviously, the Taliban meeting with the Chinese in Beijing was certainly an eye opener about how much Chinese action there is in Afghanistan, and I wouldn't doubt it over the next few years if we learn that the Chinese have been doing a lot in Afghanistan. Um, that's something I could potentially see
Yeah.
coming out, that the Chinese have had more to do in Afghanistan than we've actually openly seen.
And especially now as the US withdraws, China is very clearly trying to help fill that vacuum in Afghanistan. And to be honest, with the US's current stance on China, it's kind of strange that they aren't more bothered by this.
And I will slightly disagree with that. I do not think the Chinese are going to lose in Afghanistan because they're willing to work with the Taliban. And that's something that the US wasn't willing to do. The Russians weren't willing to work with, the Mujahideen, and we're just, I think it's more the fact that the Chinese are just willing to work with the devil on this in this situation. Um and they've done it in the past. I'm sure they'll continue to do it in the future. I mean, you don't win by fighting in Afghanistan. You win by, influencing them. I mean, you could say Pakistan has been one of the few countries to actually win in Afghanistan. Took them a while, but they eventually pulled it off. And of course, that sort of Chinese-Pakistani alliance in Afghanistan would not hurt the Chinese at all. And you know what? I think that may be everything that we have to say for today. We're gonna edit this and then throw it up on all the normal channels, so you will still be able to listen to us again if you want, or if you missed anything. It will be there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your questions, your chat, your listening, and have a great day.